I'm WebSoak and I'm building the entire New York City subway in Minecraft. The story of hills in Minecraft MTA dates back to before Minecraft MTA was anything like today. In 2008, in 2018, Minecraft MTA was known as Minecraft New York City Subway, a primitive version of the much more advanced and modern Minecraft MTA. Originally using an 80-block deep super flat world, hills were something reserved for special occasions. It was quite strange, really. You would ride around on these minecarts and a hill would randomly appear wherever I saw fit. When a new world was started in the final days of 2021, I wanted something fresh. I wanted something to really throw up the level of accuracy. A few weeks into January, I had my solution. Something every single attempt up to that point had lacked, something to change the game. That was the real-world topography, aka the hills of the city. I had started using World Edit to modify my existing recreations, my several-kilometer pancake of a world. I managed to create an accurate projection down to the intersection of New York's topography in a relatively small section of my world. The area along the one line starting at Dyckman Street up to its last stop, the line's terminus at 242nd Street in the Bronx, was entirely retrofitted with this new system. Though TMC and I found the view of an elevated line disappearing over a hill to be quite awing, the issues with this new system would soon reveal themselves. In January, I seriously lacked motivation for the project, viewing it as dated and pointless. As the previous map had taken over a year just to accomplish an amount of stations that wouldn't even be enough to fill Manhattan itself, I had started to set my sights elsewhere. However, just before this would happen would be the moment that topography would cement itself into the map's eventual return. At this time, I'd like to ask that if you're enjoying this video, then to help make my dream of this channel becoming something more a reality, by hitting the subscribe button and leaving a like. Now that you've made my day, let's get back to these rolling New York City hills. Within days of me making the final call to quit my channel, a break that would last until April, I would begin a section of the one line that would make it crystal clear that topography would be here to stay. Before fitness content would completely overtake my YouTube feed, and a thunderstorm would attempt to overtake my microphone, I built up a section of Manhattan's topography in its most extreme region, Upper Manhattan. North of Manhattan's 125th Street Valley, the terrain begins to take a steep grade, or incline. Unlike most parts of the island where the terrain typically plateaus less than 100 feet above sea level, and in a great many cases lower, the elevation would continue to climb to well above 260 feet above sea level. Then, after peaking, it crashes worse than Bitcoin, forming Manhattan's steepest cliffs, creating such a strange area that even some apartment buildings sit on stilts. The sudden drop from close to 300 feet above sea level was so influential that even New York's deepest subway station was not deep enough to avoid being forced onto an elevated structure north of Dyckman Street, resulting in one subway station with a more than 100-foot elevation difference between its exits. It was late into January when I would finally call it in and abandon the project for 2 months. However, this little enclave of terrain would forever force the acceptance of topography onto the project. Put simply, there was no way to properly represent the stations in this region without including its topography. So what did I do after returning to the project in April? I declared topography to no longer be a part of the project. The ambitious plans I once held for what was both a subway and city topographical recreation were now reduced to the former New Kansas subway system. So why did I do this? After realizing how much the project meant to me, I made the decision to continue it in March. However, upon officially returning in April, I ran into a serious issue with creating a topographic projection of Manhattan by hand. The original multi-step process it took would often take hours spread across multiple days of work to complete. I would have to first create my standard flat representation of New York streets. After that, things got quite time-consuming. The next steps would result in quite a few issues which almost led to topography being gone forever. The method I was using of projecting the terrain involved using world edit commands to elevate the streets. I would first have to create a topography marker based off the real-world elevation, then create roads, then elevate segments of the roads between the intersections, often in small sections. This part itself led to massively inflated road building times. What made it even worse? Even when I was working my hardest, my workflow was always limited by a lag spike that would occur with every section of road I elevated. This was because Minecraft would have to account for the new lighting below the roads every time they would be elevated, resulting in the server freezing more times than New Yorkers do in the winter. Finally, I had to fill in the new hollow projection. I can't just have hollow roads with floating subway stations in them after all. I would again have to go by these small sections of roads and use world edit commands to fill in the area under them with rock solid stone. To give you an idea of how time consuming this process was, each road section would vary between 30 to 70 blocks wide in some cases. The average distance between New York City subway stations is between 600 and 800 meters, or in-game blocks. Being that all of these areas consisted of these small cube-shaped sections which wildly varied in sizes, it would often take upwards of 2 to 3 days of grind work just to set up the roads for just one section. By the time I would finish building them, I would already have lost motivation and interest in the desired station. This resulted in my decision to cancel topography features in May. It happened just before releasing my first 1-to-1 scale recreation video, that being the 72nd Street station on the I and D 8th Avenue line. I originally built the 72nd Street station with topography in mind. However, after this decision to remove it, I had to completely relocate the station to sit below the standard World Gen height, as well as flatten out the slopes on top of its roads. Well, this did have the effect of leaving nasty shadows above the station. It was better than the alternative of potentially losing motivation for the project, as a result of overly grindy hills being required all over the map. While this would allow me to rapidly construct roads, it had the effect of putting Kansas back in New York City. For those of you watching from somewhere else in the world, also known as the Pancake State, Kansas is effectively a real-life super-flat state. Now back to the story. It is important to note that the original section of projected land in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx along the one line had been left untouched, which by this point had reached as far south as 166th Street along St. Nicholas Avenue and Amsterdam Avenue. So what was the significance of this? After nearly 2 months without topography, I kept asking the question, what happens when I connect the lines I built in Midtown and the Upper West Side to Upper Manhattan? Earlier this month, this question had finally eaten away at me enough that I could no longer ignore it. What was I meant to do when I had to connect this area to the rest of the map? There was a 60-block height difference between the streets after all. I was only left with two options. One was to sink the existing area into the ground and pray that I wouldn't be forced to create too steep of an incline to connect them. And option two was complete restoration of topography into the project. Upon assessing the feasibility of option one, I ran into a severe issue. Remember that I mentioned the cliffs as being so steep that they forced New York City's deepest subway line outside. This meant that no matter what, forcing the station underground would only serve to create the most unrealistically steep hill within its subway system that the project had ever seen. Likely steeper than the days of minecarts. The other issue was that it wouldn't even be possible to sink the area completely. As mentioned before, one of the exits sits roughly 100 feet lower than the other, a symptom of the area's extreme topography. This meant that creation of a hill south of the existing area was already required no matter what. So you must be wondering, hey, why did you pick option 2 when you had decided it was too time-consuming in May? Well, an underground hill or grade existed north of a station I built in June. These underground grades were completely independent of the road topography, in this case being required for an underground interchange. There was something quite enjoyable of driving a train down a hill and barreling into a station. Perhaps it was the sudden appearance of a train through a tightly confined tunnel, or just the fact that the tunnel grade made it more interesting. Regardless, I made the decision to go with option 2. With that, the ambitious topography plans were coming back. The real question to ask now was, how could I do this without encountering the same issues as before? Hills would be a required aspect of the project's realism, but they needed to be built up in a way that was somewhat fun and much quicker than before. I had come to the conclusion that my original requirements of the areas below the projected terrain needing to be stone were overly strict and unnecessarily time-consuming. The new build requirements meant that the blocks below didn't have to consist of stone, but could consist of any block. I was now able to project terrain far more efficiently. Using the /stack command, I could much more quickly lay out the elevation markers and then stack up the road intersection by intersection to create realistic hill projections in a much more speedy time. I tested out my new methods on 8th Avenue to much success, allowing me to create all of the hills on it in all of their glory, which made me realize how hilly even Midtown was. In all cases on 8th Avenue proper, an elevation change would cause at least one grade to exist in all tunnels between each of the subway stations it hosted. Although I could go into the ins and outs of the wild topography differences along 8th Avenue, I think that's a story for another video. That's all for today. If you enjoyed, then don't forget to subscribe and make sure to leave a like. Comment something below if anything about this video piqued your curiosity. I'm WebSoak and I'm saying goodbye. Thanks for watching.